Everyone, hello. Brexit is on the agenda again. Brexit is actually very rarely on the agenda in these live streams for various reasons, but it is because we've got the summit on Monday, and James went in there with High Hopes by Pink Floyd. I have high hopes. It might be one of those things though where everyone comes away disappointed because the pro-Brexit people will come away disappointed because we're moving closer to the EU. And that's what this will be. It'll be the first time for like over a decade that we've actually moved closer to the EU on anything. So that's what I'm happy about. But then other people may be disappointed because it'll be like, well, where's this massive deal then? We're not going to get a massive deal. This is the first summit. We're just going to get broad agreements. But there we go. We'll go through some questions just to begin with, because there's one here about the youth mobility. UK EU summit promising, but I expect Labour will poorly communicate this, give ammunition to reform UK, especially on the youth mobility scheme, as it will increase immigration. No, not necessarily at all. So the thing about the youth mobility thing, and I don't know exactly what's going to be announced. I think Keir Starmer is supposed to announce something on it, but because it's tied with other things, I don't know. So some of the things that will be announced on Monday will hopefully be, yes, we've agreed this, blah, 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 blah. Some of them will be, this is the sort of broad framework of what we've agreed, but there are still some details to sort out. So we will see. But in terms of the youth mobility thing, I'm sure Farage will try to complain about it, but I would suggest there are three things that will make it difficult for him to do so. Yes, admittedly, Labour and others have to be able to counter it as well. So the three things that will make it a very poor reason for Farage to complain. First of all, we're just talking about young people. Like, there isn't a when people like the anti-immigration portion of the pro-Brexit crowd, shall we say, when they are sort of thinking about the immigration they don't like, they're not worried about a few students taking a gap year or something in Britain. The second reason is the numbers are going to be limited. I mean, that was basically one of Labour's requirements because of the immigration situation. But the other thing to bear in mind is this: it's a two-way process. Now, I don't know if the numbers would balance out, especially because the numbers are capped. So what if we have a situation where the number of young British people taking the opportunity is the same as the number of EU young people coming over here? Then it's net zero immigration. And that is Nigel Farage's policy. Remember, it's not Nigel Farage's policy to have zero immigration. It's to have net zero immigration. And until we've got a few years worth of data, which by that time will be at the election anyway. So if Farage tries to make a meal out of it, all Starmer has to say is, I think you'll find this is net zero immigration, because in theory it is. I mean, obviously it depends on take-up. You might get more take-up one way than the other. But so I don't think that's a big deal at all. That should be actually quite easy to deal with. The main source of hesitation in a way will be just the general idea of, thin end of the wedge, slippery slope. Someone tried to say in the comments earlier today that Keir Starmer's rejoining the EU by stealth, and I did have to say to them, if it's that stealthy, how come you know about it? But anyway. Adam there saying, been away for a couple of weeks, mountain climbing in Morocco. What have I missed? If you've been away for 2 weeks, quite a lot. Never mind. Not holding out much hope for the UK EU summit, especially as Labour seems to be bothered more about appeasing the GAM vote. Not in this case. No, this is very different. This is one of their big impact policies for the economy, and they know that it's literally one of their biggest things. If you think about Labour's biggest policies, the ones they've been talking about a lot, and the ones that they, Keir Starmer personally keeps putting his shoulder behind. So you've got the workers' rights, the employment rights bill, to give it its full name, I suppose, properly. So workers' rights being boosted, as well as better access for unions to be able to operate. You've got the GB energy stuff, low carbon transition. You've got more affordable and social housing and just general housing in general. And you've got this. Because, every time you read about the economy and the prospects for the economy, what are you reading? You're reading that it's going to be very limited growth. We still have a stagnant economy. Stagnant economy. How do you break out of it? So you're talking about things that at the moment are not being taken account of in the forecast. And EU deals are one of them. You can't take account of whatever deal we get with the EU. Economists can't factor it into their calculations at the moment because they don't know what the deal is. When they know what the deal is, then they can start to factor it in. And they're not even going to find that out in total on Monday, but hopefully we'll get a bit more certainty next week, or we'll at least know where the framework is. So no, this is far too big a deal. And the thing is, you look at the India trade deal and it's worth 0.1% to our GDP by about 2040. And you look at the US deal, and Starmer basically admitted, if you compare it to the start of the year, trade with America at the start of the year, it's still negative. So it still represents harder trade with the United States than we had before he was inaugurated. So that's effectively worth compared to, if you think about, if we have as our baseline when Rachel Reeves announced the budget, doesn't matter whether you're talking about the October budget or the March update. So at the point at which Rachel Reeves set the budget, the India trade deal is worth 0.1%, but we don't get that 0.1% straight away. The American trade deal is negative. We might get something with Canada. Canada seems keen. But I mean, that's not necessarily going to be, it'll be worth it. Don't get me wrong. Anything's worth it. The EU deal is the only one which has the potential to add on a decent chunk to GDP, like in excess of 1% and in excess of 1%. One angry pagan, Phil, what exactly are the reasons that Angela Rayner is too divisive? Feel Labour have missed a trick with her? No, they absolutely haven't. It's just like the look, isn't it? It's like how you come across. We're quite snobbish in this country. There's a whole load of voters that will not vote for a prime minister who calls people scum and says secretary. It's really that simple. It's a bit. It's there's a lot of social snobbery in this country. There's reverse snobbery as well. You get the opposite. But yeah, you need an everyman or an everywoman type of person, someone who doesn't offend anyone. I mean, that's where the Democrats really needed Biden to step down sooner, because the problem with Harris, first of all, she was tied to the administration. That was not helpful, but she was a black woman. And it was just a massive risk when you know that there are voters in America. If they'd have just presented a white guy, they'd have probably won with the same basic campaign. The campaign itself had deficiencies, but with the same basic campaign, when you look at the result, you just thought to yourself, if they'd have just had a white guy do it, they'd have probably won. And it's the same thing here. You have to be mindful of these things. It's a bit like, we won't know for certain. I don't suppose anyone's going to do any serious polling on it. But, people wondered for quite a long time, were the Conservatives taking a risk with Rishi Sunak? You've got to remember, some of the voters that the Conservatives have lost to Reform UK are the sort of voters who have been putting out on Twitter and things like that, and they refer to Rishi Sunak as foreign. He's not, even though he's born in Britain, he's clearly got a British accent. born and raised in Britain, but no, he's not British apparently. Why? Because look at the colour of his skin. Or they'll call him a Muslim who is famously a Hindu. Why? Because he just that so those sort of people, you just think to yourself, were they taking a risk getting Sunak? Now, admittedly, they didn't have too many choices, but you do think of things like that, and you have to be very careful. And you might almost take a punt on Rayner if there was literally no one else, and she was a stunning political operator. But she's not. She's not terrible. She's quite good in debates. But there's nothing there. But so are lots of others. Do you know what? There's plenty of Labour MPs that are good in debates. Lots of them. But that's not what the public pay attention to. It's how do they come across? And she comes across those people who will absolutely love her. And like Neil Kinnock used the phrase about himself. He said the problem with him was he was Marmite. Some people loved him, some people hated him. Can I give us a guess at the timeline? Probably not. Of when you think we'll get back in Europe? Will it become the focus of the following election if Labour win a second term? I mean, there's lots of things going to happen between here and now. I am hoping that we're going to see some significant movement as we start to unlock the benefits of closer cooperation with the EU. I can't guess at a timeline as such, but I will refer you to someone who did, which is Peter Mandelson. Now, Peter Mandelson is obviously very influential within Labour. I mean, he's been made the ambassador to the United States, so he's clearly got Keir Starmer's ear. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sent him for that job. He suggested that after the sort of first two parliaments that we'd be looking at it, there will certainly be lots of calls in Labour. Like, the way I look at it is, so at the moment, we've done a complete about face. So, okay, it's still red lines, yeah, fine, whatever. But the attitude now is we want closer cooperation with the EU and basically on everything. Like, if you think about it, we're not just cherry picking. We want closer alignment on standards with the EU. We want that. Like, as in I say the government. So the government are passing legislation specifically to make aligning standards with the EU easier. We want closer trade with the EU. We want closer security and defence cooperation with the EU. We want, so it's not like the Labour government have just said, look, we went a bit too far, let's rein it back a bit. They're actually talking about and they keep using the phrase, the closest possible relationship. Now, we know that the closest possible relationship is membership, right? But they have those red lines. So the way I look at it is we're moving towards there. So we're already moving to, as if we were going to join anyway, whether we do, but we're moving in that direction. While we're moving in that direction, I would just say, just carry on supporting those moves. At some point, we'll have exhausted everything we can do within those red lines. So we'll have aligned our standards to get the lower checks. We'll have joined the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention. We'll have gone back into like different agencies that so for example, security arrangements, things like that. We'll have done all of these things, and we'll get to a point where it's like, okay, so that now we've done everything we can to boost our trade within those red lines, at which point the government then have a choice, assuming they're still the government. They have a choice. Either scrub out one of those red lines and carry on moving, or stay still. Now, if they stay still, then that will certainly be attacking. But I'm also going to just put this into the mix as well. First of all, there's already an overwhelming majority in Labour who want us to keep going, right? Keep going, keep going, keep going. Secondly, the more time, so after a few years, for example, the major fears are not Reform UK when it comes to the EU, by the way, although they may be if they don't behave themselves. the major fears are of the public not wanting to start up an argument about Brexit again. So after a few more years, those fears ease. The other thing that happens is every single year, and this more so next year, like next year there's a whole glut. Remember, it was older people that were Brexit supporters, and it wasn't just as people got older, it was a specific generation that mostly powered it. And the younger generation didn't, because the younger generation do not have that fear of the EU. So with every year, you've got an extra cohort of millions, and it is like a couple million voters, I think, who are coming of age and able to vote again. But next year, there'll be a triple whammy because Labour are lowering the voting age to 16. So, you know, all it's like a tipping point. In fact, it is like a tipping. Do you know what I've just been doing? I've been trying to prepare for when I go away to London. I'm trying to prepare a longer video on electoral reform because I shall be away for a few days, so the videos will be tricky. And one of the things I'm sort of going to explain in that video is how we've reached a bit of a tipping point in terms of fragmentation of the vote. In fact, let me see if I can just find it really quickly. So this crosses over into electoral reform, but just to show you the general thing, because the same thing will apply to... hang on a minute. The same thing will apply to... sorry, I'm trying to find something. I've lost it. Oh, there it is. To Brexit. Right, let me just grab this. Let's do a little clip of it, a little chart I was preparing. So I've sort of shown a smaller version of this in videos in the past. This goes back to 1945. So it's the combined Labour and Conservative vote every year since every general election, sorry, since 1945. And it's got you can see it was over 80%, getting quite close to 100% after like in 1951. But over time, it's slowly come down. You know, it's come down slowly but surely. Like the fact that we had this ultra fragmented vote last year was not a one-off. It's part of a trend. You can see this trend going. Like there's the odd time when it goes up, sure, you get little elections where it becomes about something else. But over time, look at it. That's quite clearly been shown over multiple decades, right? And that has been caused by a tipping point being reached as more and more people. So as this number goes down, what it represents is the percentage of voters voting for a different party outside the big two has increased. That's it. And there comes a point where you get that tipping point where all of a sudden there's enough of a percentage of people voting for a different party that it becomes possible to win a majority with a very small share of the vote. Like it used to be the case, the government, like even the losing side would get 40-odd% share of the vote. Now it's like, I mean, the losing side's got 20-odd%, but the winner got only 30-odd%. Unheard of before. Same thing with Brexit. Every year, I try and avoid talking too much about this because it's a little bit grim, it's a bit mean, but it is still the case. Every single year, a load of Brexit supporters die. I mean, Remain support or rejoin supporters die as well, but not in anything like the same numbers. So you get a net loss of Brexit supporters every single year, and you get a net increase in pro-EU voters, young people, as well. And as I say, Labour are, when we go for the next general election, whether it's, let's say it's in 5 years' time, I suspect 4, but let's say 5. We're not going to have an extra 5 years worth of young people. We're going to have an extra 7 years worth of young people because they're lowering the voting age to 16. So you're going to have at the next election a glut of younger people. And that, okay, yes, we know younger people do not vote in such large numbers, but it's not like they don't vote at all. You still get about half of them voting. So yeah, and you think about how that's going to impact it over the next 10 years. So we're getting to, there will come a point where there's a tipping point. There'll come a point where there's a critical mass of the population that is anti-Brexit bullshit, is the best way I can put it. Anti-Brexit bullshit. There will come a critical mass. And that at that point, you'll see things happen really very quickly. That is what I think. So in terms of the timeline, the end of the day, Peter Mandelson has publicly said he imagines, so Labour at the moment are on with their decade of renewal. That will be what they consider their big things. He imagines that after that, it will be time to talk about it. So obviously he talks to people in Labour as well, including people very senior. So that's what I would imagine. So I probably missed out a load of comments here. Stella Crease is the compromised progressive choice for future Labour leader, but I lament John Cross departed. Stella Creasy is very unlikely to become Labour leader. She's not even a minister. It's not impossible, but it's not necessarily usual or wise to select someone who doesn't have an experience of the running of government. I would avoid picking, just going, oh, this person should be leader because you like them or you saw that they were good in debate. There are actually a lot of MPs who are good in debates. There's a lot, when I say that they're mostly useless, a lot of them are actually quite good in debates. Particularly, and the other thing is sometimes you can get a skewed view of how good they are because you'll be listening to them talking about something that is their area of expertise. Whereas the leader has to be good in debating everything. They have to be on top of everything. Now, there will still be quite a few Labour MPs who are also good at that, some of which have been thrown away. I mean, I'm incredibly disappointed that Starmer is effectively getting rid of, he is going to get rid of Lisa Nandy in the next reshuffle. Stunningly bad idea. But I wouldn't say she'd be a good leader either, because you need to be good strategically as well. And the only area where Starmer's really going wrong, yes, we always knew he wasn't charismatic, sure. But it's not, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter. It's a very useful trait to be charismatic. But there aren't very many charismatic Labour politicians, or indeed from any party. But he just needed to get the best advisors. I have just seen a name pop up there. Could Starmer himself become a prompt for Labour as he's really unpopular? If he remains unpopular, yeah. Oh, yeah, you couldn't possibly go into the next election if he's still this unpopular. No, and that's why I think they need to urgently address it. So let's imagine, let us just say for the sake of argument, it's not true, by the way, because Keir Starmer hasn't done, they had to get rid of Boris Johnson because of Partygate. Partygate was him. That wasn't the government, that was him. So at that point, he was a dead man walking, and the Tories should have recognised that earlier. Starmer hasn't done anything. The unpopularity is tied to the fact that they don't think he's delivering. That's all that is. In some cases, of course, they also don't like some of the things he's saying and some of the policies, right? That's the government. So if people start to feel that the government is delivering, then the reverse happens. They will see that was Starmer driving it as well. So there's nothing fatal about Starmer's popularity at the moment, but Labour do need to urgently address it, because they cannot carry on like this and then find themselves 2 years out from the election and he's still a millstone around their neck. If he's still very unpopular in 2 years' time, he has to go. But don't be too eager to suggest, they should just get rid of him, because I will point out people don't think about this, but think about the consequences when you get rid of particularly a prime minister. Not just, it's in opposition, you can actually get rid of your leader quite easily. You know, if they're unpopular, get rid of them. But when they're the Prime Minister, there's the knock-on effects. So first of all, you're getting rid of the Prime Minister, so then everyone's going, so what does the government stand for, right? With the new person. Are they going to carry on doing what the previous Prime Minister did? In which case, why did you get rid of the Prime Minister? Or are they not? In which case, are you reneging on all your manifesto promises? Second thing, this may come as a surprise to some of you. I suspect it won't. The cabinet is not chosen according to competence. Even in like a competent government like we finally have now, ministers are not chosen because of their level of competence. You know, the education secretary is not chosen because she's really on top of her brief on schools. The health secretary is not chosen because he's really into healthcare. He talks about it a lot. You know, his claim to being an expert on healthcare is he had some cancer treatment, right? They're picked for political reasons. They're picked because they're the people you want running that department. They're on your wavelength in terms of what you want. So the Prime Minister says, I want the Department of Education to do this. I will pick someone who also agrees with me on that. And they do the same for all the departments. So a new leader comes in, even one who intends to carry on fulfilling the manifesto, which they really should. They will have different ideas about the way that should be done. So they will want to change. They'll have a reshuffle. And that means all the work that's happening in all those departments that get a new minister all of a sudden stops. Because the new minister has to come in, get caught up to speed. And every time you have a ministerial change, every time you have a reshuffle, the affected departments always go through a period of poor productivity because everything gets put on hold until you bring the new minister up to speed, and then they may decide to do something different, right? Quite often ministers do decide to do something different just for the sake of being different, so they can show that they're stamping their mark on it, right? Because it's a rat race. So there's huge disruption if you change the leader when you're in government. Best avoided, particularly if the problem is not the leader but the advice. Get rid of the advisors. That's easy. You can get. Keir Starmer could sack half the advisors in Downing Street tomorrow, and okay, it would be reported on, but most people wouldn't even really notice. No amount of reshuffle will fix this mess. Well, the problem is not the ministers. The problem is not the minister. The problem are the political advisors. They're absolutely appalling. They're not. You can't possibly get it this wrong this often over this period of time if you're paying attention to the data. You can get things wrong, right? Anyone, like, you know, doesn't matter how good your analysis is, you can still get the odd thing wrong, right? You can, a little bit of a misinterpretation, or something could just happen. I mean, the public are fickle, right? Something could just happen that changes people's minds on something. You know, we had the same thing, you know, we go back to something that's now caused a lot of trouble, the Scottish gender recognition bill. That had quite a lot of support, loads of support, no problem at all, nothing really controversial about it. Till all of a sudden, oh dear, that prisoner assault, all of a sudden the public turned. So that can happen. You can have something like that happen. But you cannot be making this many mistakes this often. And the cumulative effect has been an absolute murder in the polls. If you are data driven. I know they're not data driven because it'd be impossible to make this many mistakes if they were. Willing to bet Starmer resigns just after next year's local elections. Fully expecting reform to sweep up next year. I am not expecting reform to sweep up next year. I'd be curious to understand why you think they will. You've got to remember there's various things. First of all, in another year's time, Labour's major legislation will then have passed. Okay, then they need to be pushing that. But it'll be in their interest to do so. It'll be in their interest to do so. So the it'll be the Employment Rights Act. It'll be in law. The planning reforms will be in law. So Labour should be able to go around all the time going, oh, look, new building. Keir Starmer should be out and about wearing a hard hat every other day, right? So Labour will have more material to work with next year because their legislation will be through. Yes, they're going to have to sharpen up their communication skills to maximise it, but they will have more material to work with. Reform UK, remember, in a year's time, there will be a bit of a progress report on how they've been doing in the councils they now control, right? So that could be a bit of a stumbling block for them. Trump could also, I mean, Trump and Putin combined, because Farage is close to, well, he's very close to Trump. And, okay, he's not close to Putin technically, but he is always coming up with excuses for him. So there's lots of reasons to suppose. And also, the other thing to bear in mind, is in different years, the local elections are not, they're not homogenous. There's different ones. There are some areas where Reform UK do well, and there are some areas where they don't. So, and I haven't looked, admittedly, but if a lot of the local elections up for grabs, a lot of the councils up for grabs next year are the areas where Reform UK that are not that Brexity, for example, then that will limit them as well. And remember, I want to point something out. Although Reform UK won and they won a lot of seats, right? They won a lot of seats early this month. It was by small margins. So you combine several factors. Labour having more material on their big legislation, Reform UK's record of running councils maybe giving people pause for thought, particularly if there's some real, shitstorms going on. The fact that the council's up for next year, which again, I haven't checked them out. Yeah, I'm not going to yet. There's no point. But the council's up for grabs next year if they're not as Brexity. All of those things will shrink Reform UK's share of the vote. And remember, they didn't get a big share of the vote. They got a big share of the seats won this month. They didn't get a massive share of the vote. So they just won first past the post in a way that they lost it. They were the big losers of first past the post last year, and they were the big winners of it this year. That's all. So I see no reason to suppose that Reform UK will clean up next year. I'm not saying they definitely won't, by the way, because I haven't looked at the specific seats. But I think there are good reasons to suppose they won't. Starmer really has to stop just ceding ground to the social conservatives. So, yeah, see, the thing is, I mean, well, what he has to do is he needs advisors who are data-driven, not ideologically driven. Like he keeps saying as well, they're not going to do performative politics, pragmatism over ideology. And it's like, but his advisors are the opposite of that. They're absolutely the opposite of that. They are driven by ideology. He may be driven by pragmatism, but his advisors are not, and he needs to get rid of them. If I was the Prime Minister and they were telling me to do this mad shit, I'd be saying, I want you to show me the proof that this is going to work. I want you to show me it. Before the last general election, a Labour insider claimed it would be 24 to 36 months before any benefits are seen. Is this theory on track, i.e. poor polling? So in terms of major benefits filtering through, yeah, I mean, if you think about like workers' rights, so they knew the legislation would take at least a year. You've got to remember, this July they'll have been in power for a year, and there'll still be some bits of legislation still to go through. So it will have taken them over 12 months to get the legislation in place. Then you've got to be able to communicate to people that you've done it. Some people will see the benefit straight away. Some of these pieces of legislation, there'll be an implementation period. The legislation that relates to planning reforms. So what people really want is to see the things built. Well, a lot of those projects will be another year or two to be built, won't they? So that'll be what they're talking about there. So yeah, in terms of people really feeling the benefits, yes, 24 to 36 months. But people may still give Labour credit for some of the things that they will have done next year if they can plug the fact that they've actually done them. Like Labour can actually get they can generate a bit of optimism by just literally going around building sites and getting those on the news and going, this is going to be the new thing here, this is the new thing here, stuff like that. A lot of our Labour base are on PIP. Bosses kicking our base. Needs it. The PIP thing was absolutely. I cannot. Again, I mean, I said it with the winter fuel allowance. When they first announced it, I said in the first video, I said, this is bold. And I, at the time, would have thought, I don't think the Lords are holding anything up at the moment now, Richard. I would have thought they must have done their research on it. And they clearly hadn't. They clearly hadn't. What should have happened, if they did not have really very robust evidence that the public would accept the means testing of winter fuel allowance, without that, any decent political advisor in Downing Street should have told the Prime Minister to block it. They should have said, you cannot allow this policy to go through. And that it does go through Downing Street, by the way. Any potentially controversial, obviously individual departments formulate their own policy, but anything that might be politically controversial goes to Downing Street. It all goes through Downing Street. And it's their job to go, no, we're not doing this. Are you crazy? We're not pissing off old people. And the same thing with PIP. You know, they should have recognised that it's a proportionately larger share of their vote in some key areas where they are competing with Reform UK. Absolute madness. Absolute madness that there was no one in Downing Street saying, we cannot do this. This would be lunacy. What happened to no more sticking plaster politics? We seem to be getting more and more sticking plaster politics. I don't think we are. I think you're just focusing. You may be getting that from the stuff that Labour keep announcing to the press, but that's just distract. I mean, that's what I would call performative politics, which they also said they were going to not have. No, the stuff they're doing is very long term. You know, again, remember, what are the major things they're doing? GB Energy, the legislation for water companies. Remember, that hasn't finished either. There's a review, I think, supposed to be reporting in a few months on what to do with water companies in general. So it's not just their measures on dealing with water companies and the water industry is not just threaten to put them in prison if they don't behave themselves. They are actually looking at ways of fundamentally reforming the whole thing, which could well, and I hope it does. I don't expect them to nationalise the whole thing. So for me, the best compromise is run as not-for-profits like Welsh Water, because that's you take profit out of the system and actually it's fine. You still need ministerial oversight, but as long as you can make sure Ofwat are fit for, if the ombudsman, if the watchdog is fit for purpose, then yeah, not-for-profits are okay. That's okay. Pronator there saying, going back to Brexit in the room, whenever I get canvassed, I say my vote is earned by a say on the referendum since I was 7 months too young in 2016. I mean, all I can say is what they're doing at the moment is aligning with the EU and moving back towards the EU. They are setting out certain red lights. But I would say, with the exception of the customs union, because we could actually join that quite rapidly, I think, they're not actually doing anything different to a government that was openly saying, let's say, do you know what? Some amazing thing happened at the last election and the Lib Dems won. Let's say they won a majority. Something mad happened, right? So they were quite happy to be openly with joining the EU again. The Lib Dems wouldn't actually be any further along than Labour are at the moment. The mood music might be more positive in Brussels. In fact, I'm sure it would be. But in terms of like what we would have achieved, it would all still be on that path. The only exception, I think the only difference between where we will be at the next election and where we could be is we could have joined the customs union. Obviously, we can't because they've ruled it out. But there we go. Oh dear, there's a tricky question here. What legislation has been pushed to create the 7 to 9 new reservoirs and forests? Will that likely come partly under the planning legislation? In terms of legislation, I don't know. That's just part of, that's just part of a commercial decision, effectively, that unlocked the funding for water being allowed to raise their bills. Because customers are going to have to pay higher bill. And it's not just don't imagine these increases in the bills for the next 5 years are it. There'll be another one after it. There's decades worth of investment that suddenly now needs to be produced. But in terms of the planning reforms, in terms of actually getting the things built, I suppose they will use whatever planning rules exist at the time. So I imagine because the planning reform legislation is supposed to be passed, I think by autumn, it probably will use that new legislation, yes. How is GB Energy going to help individuals now? They need to address the soaring energy prices and profiting by the energy firms, not promise that something that nobody knows anything about. So first of all, it helps by jobs. First of all, it's going to create quite a lot of jobs. The other thing is they've already taken over the part of the national grid that allocates energy. And as they build up their own energy production, that will bring the costs down because it's going to be purely green energy, clean energy, which is a lot cheaper. That's how it will work. Now, again, just like with water companies, there's going to be some decisions about further reforms potentially. The same thing is true of energy. Remember, I did a video about it a week or two ago. There are some potential ideas for shaking things up in the shorter term as well, including zonal pricing. But remember, energy companies, the bigger energy companies are effectively profiteering, but they're not profiteering in the same way that gas and oil are. Remember, energy companies don't set their prices. So, although I know you'll think to yourself things like you've seen some of the big energy companies making massive profits. That's not profit. Profiteering is when you ramp up your own prices to take advantage of some shortage in the market or something like that, usually. They're not doing that because they don't set their own prices. The Ofgem effectively do that, or they cap them. So they're not profiteering. Some of the larger ones are making massive profits. Why? Because they're able to, the amount that they can charge for the electricity they generate is tied to the cost of producing it using gas. And so if you've got a large energy company that, okay, maybe it's got a gas power station, but it's also got a shitload of wind farms, it's going to make massive profits because it's charging as much for the electricity from the wind farms as it is from the gas. And that's because we're too reliant on gas. As soon as we are, instead of getting 50% of our energy from gas, as soon as we're getting 5% of it, the prices will come right down. I just don't know when that point will be reached. Will that be in the next 5 years, or is that more 10 years? I'm not sure about that. Alex saying they might be referring to the power station. No, that's what I'm assuming. It doesn't make any sense otherwise. I'm talking about the ones who actually produce the energy, yes. But that is why they're able to make such large profits, because the big energy companies also produce energy from cheaper sources, but they charge the same because that's how the system has to work. Hang on a minute, what's this? I've got to read something out. Part of a group trying to push a petition, to get the UK government to rejoin the European Union. Our last petition got over 100,000, was debated in Parliament. So I don't know whether you've already done it. What I would do is don't do a petition that says we should rejoin the EU. Would be my advice. Obviously, you do what you want. My advice would be a petition. There's a balance, isn't there? My advice would, generally speaking, be a petition, because if you ask Parliament the same question, you'll get the same answers. There can still be a benefit in having something debated, because then it can be reported on. But I would ask for something that is a smaller step, that is at the moment outside of what the government is agreeing to do, but just outside it. Now, I also appreciate that in order to get 100,000 signatures, you also want to make sure it sounds exciting. But that's what I would say. It's like, so there is a bit of a balance. If you do something that sounds a bit pedestrian, you may not get the 100,000. But if you do something that's way beyond what the government, or put it this way, if you're going to ask for something that is not just something that the government haven't talked about, but is actively something that they're definitely going to say no to, because it's, you know, crosses their red lines. That's what I would think. Because again, how many petitions have we had to join the EU? I would have it as something new that is somewhere between what the government have already announced and that. Did a customs union one, didn't get very far, as I don't think it's how it said. Yeah, I know, and that is the problem, isn't it? And no, most people won't know what the customs union is. Most people don't know what the single market is. Most people don't know what the EU is. Most people don't know what Brexit is. The reason Theresa May said Brexit is specifically so she didn't have to answer the question of what is Brexit then. Oh, Brexit's Brexit. Okay, yeah, what is that? Give me the dictionary definition. That's what, if we'd have had a proper bloody opposition at the time, that would have been the question being asked of her every single week. You say Brexit means Brexit. Give me the... If it's that simple, if it's not a complicated question, if it's a simple question, give me your dictionary definition, right? You're right in the dictionary. You're right in the next edition of the dictionary. You've got to define Brexit. Tell me. Tell me what it is. Should have been hammered every single week. Anyway, doesn't. In the past, forget it. But there are, I mean, the other thing I will point out, it's, you know, we have a parliament. A year ago, we had a parliament that was mostly, whether ideologically or what they thought was pragmatically, pro-Brexit. Now we have a parliament that is overwhelmingly pro-EU, right? And this is the way to think about the strategy. What you're trying to unlock at the moment is politics. It's not about, you don't need to persuade the government that we should be inside the EU. The government already know that. So the most senior member of the government, as well as some other very senior members of the government, campaigned very hard for us to not leave the EU. So always have in your mind, don't be one of those people who thinks that Keir Starmer and everyone else was kicked in the head by a horse. I think some of his advisors may have been. You know, they haven't suddenly changed their minds. The politics changed, not them. So it's a case of trying to think. We need more people to engage with the public as well. Everyone should, wherever they can. I mean, don't start fights or anything, but keep talking about how, you know, Brexit issues with people you know who are willing to listen. But in terms of getting debates in, I mean, if you keep asking the same ones, the MPs will just increasingly roll their eyes and just say, we already did this. We just done it. So there needs to be like there needs to be something new about it. I mean, one thing I would like, but I also accept this may not get many votes either, signatures either, would be, and this should be reasonable, why don't we have an economic impact assessment report on Brexit? Why are we not having a Brexit review? Next year, we're having a review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, right? That's set down in law, well, in the treaty. So we're having a review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Why don't we have a review of Brexit? But again, you know, that's not my... I don't know whether that would get many signatures either. Andrew, they often say Starmer has a tin here, but I'm inclined to agree. The problem is chaotic and inept political advisors. Well, I'll say two things there. First of all, I will say Keir Starmer is known to listen. He does listen. He does genuinely listen. Doesn't necessarily mean he takes on board what people say. But also, I am also going to say the advisors are bad, but he chose the advisors. So he still has to take responsibility. How damaging would it be for Labour to U-turn on some of the controversial socially conservative stances? Right, so if I was, I mean, you know, let's say he did sack all his advisors and got me in. I wouldn't go to London Leg really, but you know, I'm on Teams, or Google Meet or something. So let's say I was trying to offer some advice, and I'm not suggesting he should take my advice. He should take it with others, maybe. The winter fuel allowance, we're probably getting an announcement next week. That could be. That can be U-turned on very easily. Labour are talking about not getting rid of the means testing altogether, just raising the threshold. What I would say there, my advice there is, do not tweak the threshold. Ram it up. At the moment, it's something like, is it about, someone tell me, it's about £11,500 to qualify. I would say ram it up to £25,000 a year. £25,000 a year. Straight up. Then there's no arguments about it. Or do what Martin Lewis suggested and base it on council tax banding. Or one or the other, like, you know, double jeopardy. So either your income is below a certain level, or you are in council tax, whatever. Council tax band, whatever. So that is Labour. Or I read some reports. Labour already know they can U-turn on that safely. Then there's the PIP stuff. What I would say there is, first of all, I am actually going to tell people the Department for Work and Pensions are they have launched, I think, a public consultation. What they should do there to U-turn on it is they don't have to actually U-turn as such. They just have to make sure that the requirements to qualify end up looking suspiciously the same as they already are. And hopefully later this year, because they can get away with it now, unless there's another bloody by-election, as long as Labour MPs can avoid being convicted for anything in the next few months, they can even wait until they've got a better handle on what the next budget statement's likely to be. If it looks a bit better, unfortunately, I think Donald Trump's handiwork will not necessarily make things look better. But if all of a sudden we've got a bit more fiscal headroom, or Rachel Reeves can work out some way of increasing taxes, because the PIP policy was mostly linked to the cost of it rather than the principle, that is an easy one to effectively U-turn on. Would I advise him to move Parliament to Scunthorpe? No, Doncaster. Doncaster has the main train station and a hedge in the shape of St George, which Nigel Farage should love. He loves St George, doesn't he? That Turkish little rogue. But anyway, the St George, that is the Turkish rogue, not Farage. He's Hungarian, of course. The next one. What's the next one? The trans rights things. Yeah, that's messy. They've got themselves into a mess there. They should still U-turn on it because they do not want to end up in a battle with the European Court of Human Rights. That just plays into Farage's hands. Do you know what? I would just come out and U-turn on it. Do you know what I would do, actually? If I was Starmer, I would make some announcement about tidying up the legislation at the same time as announcing something very popular like reinstating the PIP and winter fuel allowance or something. There we go. Bojo's Turkish or something. Yeah, he's of Turkish descent as well. What else have they done that shit the bed? The immigration stuff, I would largely leave it as it is. Just as in terms of the rhetoric, I would say nothing about immigration except when new numbers come out. But I would massage things behind the scenes. Um, yeah, so that they don't have to make an announcement about any sort of U-turn on immigration issues. They can just quietly change the way they do things and say nothing about it. But announce at this, do it all at the same time. Do it all at the same time. You know, we've had a review and we're just going to make a few little tweaks here. Absolutely hate the PIP changes cuts to welfare as someone directly affected, but I would gladly accept PIP as means tester, so it's not going to go to upper class. So that was, I mean, that was the thing I thought at the time. I thought, ironically, if they'd have means tested PIP, it's still, to me, I mean, I'm happy with means testing winter fuel allowances. Because elderly people don't have more heating, well, some may, but in general, an elderly person doesn't have more heating needs than a younger person. Either your house is cold or it is not. So the winter fuel allowance was effectively to take account of the fact that the cost of living was biting. Whereas PIP is specifically to cover the costs that you incur that, like, someone without those disabilities does not. Like, there are certain costs I do not incur, like, for, you know, operating my basic life that they do. So I wouldn't actually be in favour of means testing PIP, simply because even if they're wealthy, those costs are still their costs, right? Whereas if you're a wealthy person in winter, you know, you don't have any special need for extra energy as an elderly person, unless you also happen to have a disability of some kind, right? So, but at the same time, I would accept it. If it was a face-saving way to get out of it, yes, I would say, okay, means test it, beginning at £50,000 a year or something, right? It wasn't St. George Palestinian, was he? I thought it was Turkish. Jesus was Palestinian. But I'm not an expert on these things. 10-year residency before citizenship, the highest in the world, isn't it? Even higher than Japan. I'm not an expert, but I believe so, yes. It's also, there is actually, I did actually put out a petition on Blue Sky and Twitter recently. There's a petition going around to get the government to rethink one aspect of it, and that is, unfairly, they're doing it retrospectively. Now, that is totally unfair, because there's people who've been resident here for 4 years and will be planning on applying for permanent settled status next year. Those plans have been thrown out now. That's unfair on those people, because when people move to a country, they have a long-term plan, right? And it's not fair to change the goalposts unless you've got some major national security reason to do so. And this does not qualify as a major national security issue. So it should not be retrospective. In fact, it should only apply the 10-year thing. If you're going to do it at all, and I really see no reason to do it at all. If someone's going to live here for 5 years, no trouble. What's an extra 5 years going to do? Like, I'd like to listen to the thinking on that. What do you think the extra 5 years does? So anyway, and also it doesn't mean if you've been 5 years, you're guaranteed to have permanent settled status anyway. There's still hoops to jump through. Bloody ridiculous. Anyway, what I would say, however, is it should only apply, the 10-year thing should only apply to people who move to the UK after the legislation has passed or it's been implemented, whatever they're doing. It may be secondary legislation, I don't know. That's what I would say. I think it's grossly unfair. People move into a different country. It's a big step. It can be quite. I think people who just move can feel quite vulnerable while they're. I mean, I've moved a few times, but I am someone who is a bit of a homebody. But I think a lot of people can feel quite vulnerable when they're moving. When you move into a different country, you're going to feel very vulnerable. So. Chris there, I think this is going back to the PIP Means tested, not something I would outright approve of either. Arguably much fairer than broad cuts, making it hard to still be eligible for PIP. It would certainly be fairer. I mean, means testing any benefit is inevitably fairer than just cutting it. But I would say there are some benefits that people get because they're on low incomes. It's a benefit to help you cover the cost of living because we do not pay a real living wage or pension. Right? That's the problem. So we have some benefits that are paid because people in work or retired pensioners do not get an adequate income on their pension or wage. But there are some benefits that exist because, like, this is I mean, there's not many of them, but this is one of them. PIP is because you have costs for everyday living that are not your fault. Unless I suppose you did something very stupid to give yourself a disability. But I don't think it would be fair to apply an idiot's tax either. But, you know, ultimately, you know, you're going to be... Adam's saying my nan's house used to be like a sauna. Well, if you're an elderly person who can afford to have the heating on without cutting back anywhere else, you don't need the winter fuel allowance. But what I would say is just make sure. Don't fanny about. Just set the allowance up to, like, I mean, whatever, 20,000, 25,000. Just make sure no one gets to claim, I can't afford to put the heating on. Because if you're on 11,500 isn't very much, is it? Let's be honest. It's not even £1,000 a year. Sorry, a month. Not even £1,000 a month. And okay, it depends on your expenses, I guess. I mean, you know, if you're in a bungalow and you own your own bungalow, sure, you can get by on £1,000 a month. Yes, absolutely, if you're retired. But if you don't, if you still have housing costs and things, you can't. An idiot's tax should be no state pension to anyone who voted leave. You know, that would be punishing people for their vote. Also, it's anonymous, so they could just like change their mind. One of the only areas Labour have not turned socially conservative on is green energy, environment, biodiversity. Well, those sort of things are more economic as well, I would argue. The biodiversity one, though, I think they are being criticised on a few areas there. No, I would. It is actually interesting you bring this up, though, because I'm going to go through the manifesto at some point soon. We have to close up in a minute. I'll just leave this as my last point. And the reason is this, because Labour have now clearly, they've made a very conscious decision to try and turn the party into something that it's left-wing. People that keep saying, oh, it's right-wing. It's not right-wing. It's very left-wing. But, well, I say very left-wing. It's clearly left-wing, but socially conservative. And so I'm going to now go through the manifesto because I want to know now how many socially progressive policies do Labour still have? But there are some. They want to reduce the voting age to 16. That's not an economic policy. That is a socially progressive policy. So it's not that they have none. But I do now worry. They didn't have that many to begin with in the manifesto. Most of the manifesto promises were economic. And they did, you know, they were open about that. They said we're focusing on the economy. The economy's knackered, right? Whereas the last Labour government focused on the economy and social. There was a lot of socially progressive stuff. And I think that also helped mould. It's quite funny because you get some people, and there are, you get some people who really properly hate Tony Blair. And yet they don't seem to realise that this idea of socially progressive Labour doesn't go back to their origins at all. It's quite recent. I would suggest that Labour only became very socially progressive under Blair. You know, they weren't at all. In fact, Labour under Harold Wilson were very racist. The party was very racist in terms of the legislation it passed. The first Labour government that passed a lot of legislation to progress social issues was the last Labour government. That is not to excuse this movement, but I'm just saying it's not a core part of Labour to be socially progressive. But we have gotten used to it after the last Labour government. Last one there, just have I started the Dark Brotherhood Questline Oblivion? I did, yes. For those who don't know, it's a computer game, and you join this is a band of assassins, and you join them by killing an innocent. I will say, however, I killed them accidentally. It wasn't my fault. But there it is. Right, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of evening, and we will see what happens on Monday. I am expecting lots of people to be disappointed, but I am hoping for some good results. But have a great evening. Until next time, see you later.